Hello everyone. Before we get started, don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. That way, YouTube knows to keep sharing more stories like this with you. Now, let's jump in. It's hard to even begin describing that night without my stomach tightening up. I've gone over it in my head 100 times, trying to rationalize what happened, trying to find an explanation that makes sense, but every time I think about it, it feels like I'm right back there again, in the suffocating dark of those West Virginia woods, where everything felt wrong in a way I can't quite put into words. It was about 2 or 3 years ago. I've lived in southern West Virginia my entire life, and I've always been surrounded by mountains and trees. Out here, the forest isn't just a backdrop, it's everywhere. It's in your backyard, it presses up against every road, and at night it feels endless. The darkness is thicker than anything I've ever experienced anywhere else. The kind that swallows your flashlight beam after just a few yards. You grow up getting used to it, but there's still a certain weight to the nights here that never stops making you feel small. That evening started like any other. My buddy Mark had come over. We'd known each other since middle school. The kind of friend you don't need to impress. We were just hanging out in my living room, half watching a UFC replay, half playing Xbox, killing time. It was one of those long summer nights when the air outside feels heavy and slow, and there's that faint hum of cicadas through the open windows. Eventually, sometime after midnight, we both got that restless energy that makes you want to just go outside for no reason. Mark mentioned we should go for a walk. Maybe smoke a joint just to stretch our legs and enjoy the quiet. There's a trail about a 10-minute walk from my place. It's not long, maybe a couple of miles total, but it cuts straight through dense woods that seem to close in tighter the farther you go. During the day, it's peaceful. At night, it's different. Even with a flashlight, the woods seem to swallow everything beyond a few feet. Still, I'd walked it dozens of times, so I didn't think twice. We left my place around 1 in the morning. The air outside was cool, not cold, but enough that you could see your breath in the beams of the flashlight. The humidity clung to everything, and the smell of wet earth and pine needles was strong. There was no moon that night, just a low cloud cover that made the darkness feel endless. We followed the cracked pavement down the hill until we hit the start of the trail, a narrow dirt path that disappeared between tall trees. As soon as we stepped into the woods, the sounds of the world changed. It was still alive with insects, and the occasional rustle of something moving through the undergrowth. The kind of constant background noise you barely notice until it's gone. We talked quietly as we walked, mostly nonsense, laughing about nothing. It was the kind of easy calm you get when you know there's no one else around. After about 30 minutes, we stopped at a spot where the trail curved sharply and opened up slightly. It was halfway through, a sort of natural clearing surrounded by tall oaks and sycamores. The ground was covered with a thick layer of dead leaves, and the smell of moss was strong. We figured it was as good a place as any to stop, so we leaned against a fallen log and started rolling the joint. Mark's lighter flicked a few times before catching, the small flame looking impossibly bright against the dark. We smoked quietly, passing it back and forth, just listening to the woods around us. The forest was alive that night, too alive. You could hear scurrying, branches snapping, owls calling from somewhere in the distance, the kind of overlapping noises that normally make the woods feel full of life. But there was something different about it. It felt restless, like everything out there was on edge. At first, we didn't think much of it. Maybe there was a fox or a deer nearby. Stuff like that makes the smaller animals nervous. But the longer we stood there, the stranger it felt. The air seemed thicker. The noise was constant, but it didn't sound natural anymore. It was like the whole forest was humming with tension. We finished smoking and decided to start heading back. Mark kicked some dirt over the embers from the joint and we started walking again. I remember thinking I'd never heard the woods so loud that late at night. And then, almost instantly, it all stopped. The silence hit us like a wall. 1 second it was buzzing with life, and the next it was completely dead. Not a cricket, Not a rustle, not a whisper of wind in the trees. It was the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. We froze. I could feel my heart beating in my throat. The air felt heavier, like even breathing took effort. I remember thinking it was strange how quickly everything went still. But before I could even say anything, there was a sound. It came from somewhere off the trail, deep in the trees. A voice. It didn't sound human, not really. It was shaky and uneven. The kind of voice that makes your brain twist trying to figure out what you're hearing. It was like a broken recording of a person. Too robotic and flat, but still somehow carrying emotion. The sound was warped, as if it came through an old toy speaker, crackly and strained. It wasn't loud, but it wasn't distant either. It had that strange in-between volume, where you can't tell how far away it really is. I couldn't make out any actual words. It was like the sounds were just barely forming into something that could have been speech. Up and down, uneven, like a child trying to mimic talking. The way it carried through the trees made my skin crawl. Every part of my body was telling me to run. I could feel Mark's energy change beside me. He was tense, every muscle locked. We didn't even need to say anything. We just took off. I don't know how long we ran. It felt like forever. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, cutting through the darkness just far enough to keep us on the path. Every few seconds I'd glance over my shoulder expecting to see something following us, but there was nothing. Just the empty black of the woods. The worst part was that the voice didn't fade. It stayed the same distance away, the same volume repeating over and over. The same broken pattern. It didn't chase us, but it didn't fall behind either. It was like it was everywhere at once, surrounding us no matter how far we ran. My lungs were burning. My legs felt like they were turning to lead. The path was uneven and I nearly tripped several times. The smell of dirt and decaying leaves filled my nose, thick and choking. I remember focusing on just breathing, on putting one foot in front of the other, because stopping wasn't an option. The voice never got louder, but it didn't go away, and that somehow made it worse. Eventually, I saw the faint reflection of the trailhead sign ahead, just the shimmer of metal in the flashlight beam. That sight almost made me cry with relief. We slowed down only a little as the dirt gave way to gravel. I thought we were in the clear. I thought whatever it was would stay in the woods. Then, just as we were maybe 5 minutes from the road, the scream came. It was behind us. It cut through the air so sharply it didn't even sound real at first. It wasn't the shriek of an animal, not a mountain lion or a bobcat. I've heard both before. They have that high-pitched cat-like wail that echoes through the trees. This was different. This was human, but not. It was deep at first, then tore upward into a pitch that hurt my ears. It wasn't just loud, it was violent. It had this raw, tearing quality, like it was ripping through the air itself. You could feel it in your chest, vibrating your bones. Birds exploded out of the trees in every direction, their wings slapping branches. The sound rolled through the woods, bouncing back on itself, echoing until it felt like the whole mountain was screaming. I don't even remember making the decision to run. We just did. My flashlight beam jerked and flickered as I sprinted, the gravel crunching hard under my boots. My heart was hammering so fast I thought I was going to black out. The scream stopped as suddenly as it started, leaving that crushing silence again. We didn't slow down. We hit the open road, both of us gasping for breath, bent over with our hands on our knees. My chest felt like it was on fire. From there, it was maybe a 5-minute run to where we'd parked. The car was sitting under a flickering streetlight, and it was the most welcoming thing I'd ever seen. We threw ourselves inside, slammed the doors, and just sat there, shaking. I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Neither of us said a word for a long time. The silence in the car felt almost unreal after what had just happened. I kept glancing at the tree line, half expecting to see someone or something step out. But the woods were still, completely still. We drove back to my place without the radio on. Every sound outside the car, every bump in the road, every rustle in the dark made me flinch. When we pulled into my driveway, I noticed my hands were trembling. It took a while before I could even step out of the car. That night I barely slept. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to figure out what it could have been. The voice, the way it stayed the same distance no matter how far we ran. The scream at the end. All of it felt too deliberate, too targeted. But what kind of person or animal could move like that? How could anyone mimic that sound? The next morning we went back to the trail. I didn't want to, but something in me needed to see it in daylight. The air was cool and the woods looked completely normal. Peaceful even. Birds were chirping. The wind moved through the branches and the sunlight filtered through the leaves in that soft, golden way that makes everything seem harmless. We walked the same path we had the night before. Halfway in, the spot where we'd stopped to smoke was exactly as we'd left it. The log, the trampled leaves, even the faint ash on the ground. But standing there, I realized something that made my stomach turn. There were no footprints leading off the trail. None. The ground was soft from the humidity. It should have shown something if anyone or anything had been walking through. But the dirt was untouched. The only tracks were ours from the night before. We didn't stay long. The farther we walked, the more wrong it felt. There was this sense that something unseen was watching from the trees, not moving, just there. We turned back and didn't look behind us again. Since then, I've told maybe 3 people about that night. Most just laugh or shrug it off, saying it was probably an animal, maybe a prank. But I know what I heard. I've lived here my whole life. I know the sounds of every animal in these woods, from coyotes to owls to cats. This wasn't any of those. It was something else. For a long time, I wouldn't go near that trail after dark. Even now, if I drive past it, I get that same tight feeling in my chest. Sometimes, late at night, if I leave my window open, I think I can hear faint sounds from the woods. A strange, uneven rhythm, almost like someone trying to form words but never quite managing. I tell myself it's just the wind, that it's just my brain trying to make sense of noises in the dark. But I'll never forget the feeling of that voice following us, the way it never faded, the way the forest seemed to breathe with it. I've never felt fear like that before or since. Whatever it was that night, it knew we were there. It wanted us to know it too, and I don't think it was ever far away. It was late afternoon when we reached the top of Big Frog Mountain, the kind of light where everything looks calm and harmless, but you can already feel the darkness waiting to take over. The air was cooler than it had been at the base, that soft kind of mountain chill that rolls down from the trees and smells faintly like damp moss and wood smoke. I had borrowed my dad's old Ford, which rattled a little when it idled, but it had always gotten me where I needed to go. The sun was sliding down behind the tree line, and the mountains seemed empty. No other cars, no other voices, just that steady hum of crickets and the distant whisper of wind pushing through pines. She was sitting next to me, leaning on the window with her hair brushing against her cheek. We had driven up here because we wanted to get away from everyone else for a while. It felt quiet, safe, like the rest of the world was somewhere far below us. When I killed the engine, the silence was deep, almost too deep. There were no houses around, no lights, no signs of other people. Just an old dirt trail leading into the woods, half hidden by overgrown brush. We sat for a minute, talking quietly, then decided to take a short walk before it got dark. I remember stepping out of the car, stretching my legs and breathing in the air. It smelled sharp and earthy, like wet leaves and clay. She slipped her jacket on and followed behind me as I walked toward the start of the trail. The ground there was soft from the rain earlier that day, and not even 20 feet behind the car. My boot sank into a mud puddle. It wasn't deep, but what caught my attention was the color. The water wasn't the dark grayish-brown you'd expect. It was this strange pale tan, like watery clay mixed with something lighter. It had a weird shimmer under the last bit of sunlight. Almost oily, but not quite. I remember standing there for a second, staring down at it. My first thought was maybe it had washed out from some kind of construction, or exposed rock further up. But there wasn't any construction this far up the mountain. It was just trails and trees for miles. I pointed it out to her, but neither of us said much. She looked uneasy and I didn't blame her. There was something about it that didn't sit right with me either. Still, I shook it off and started walking up the trail. The woods were dense but beautiful in that late day light. The sunlight filtered through the canopy in streaks, hitting little ferns and wildflowers along the path. We didn't go far, maybe a few hundred yards. The trail started to narrow, and you could feel the air changing. It got cooler, heavier, and quieter. The bugs had stopped making noise, and that silence always makes you feel watched, like there's something just off the trail keeping pace with you. I could sense her unease growing. She wasn't saying anything, but her steps got slower. Eventually, she stopped altogether and said she didn't want to keep going. I turned around and nodded, relieved she said it first. The quiet up there felt unnatural. We turned back toward the car, the only sound being the crunch of gravel under our boots. By the time we got back, the light had dimmed more. I wiped the mud off my shoe on the grass and climbed into the car. The interior still smelled faintly of old vinyl and gasoline. We sat there for a bit, not starting the engine, just enjoying the cool air coming through the open windows. Then, like teenagers do, one thing led to another, and we ended up lying across the front seat, kissing and laughing in that half-dark space. Her arm hung lazily out the passenger window, her fingers dangling just outside the door. That was when I first felt it. It's hard to explain the sensation, but I'd felt it before, like someone standing directly behind me, even when I knew no one was there. It wasn't fear at first, more like a weight or pressure in my back. This instinctive pull that makes the hairs on your arms rise. I didn't say anything for a second, then the feeling grew stronger, as if something was standing close, watching. My stomach turned cold. Without thinking, I told her to pull her hand in. She did, probably thinking it was just mosquitoes or something. I rolled her window up halfway and tried to shake it off. We kept going, but a few minutes later the feeling came back, sharper this time. It was like static electricity crawling along my spine. I rolled the window up the rest of the way. I remember the silence that followed. It felt heavy. Even the wind outside had died. I didn't want to spook her, so I said nothing and tried to ignore it. Then, out of nowhere, it hit like a jolt. The sensation shot through my back like someone pressed a live wire against my skin. Every nerve lit up. My chest tightened and I couldn't breathe for a second. I sat straight up, heart hammering, scanning the mirrors and windows, half expecting to see someone standing there in the darkness beside the car. But there was nothing. Just the outline of trees and the faint reflection of our own faces in the glass. I started the car without saying anything, my hands trembling a little as I turned the key. The headlights cut through the dark, lighting up the empty trail ahead. I threw it into reverse and started down the mountain road, trying to steady my breathing. She asked what was wrong, but all I could say was that something didn't feel right. I couldn't explain it. It wasn't just fear. It felt like a warning, like something had been right there with us and I had ignored it for too long. The drive down was quiet. The dirt road twisted between the trees, and the headlights caught little bits of mist drifting across the path. Every few seconds I glanced in the rearview mirror. My mind kept playing tricks, thinking I saw movement at the edge of the light, shapes that disappeared the moment I focused on them. I gripped the wheel tighter and didn't say a word. By the time we reached my parents' house, the tension in my chest had eased a little, though my nerves were still shot. The familiar sound of dogs barking and the glow from the porch lights made it feel safer. Inside, everything was normal. My parents watching TV, the smell of dinner still hanging in the air. They asked how the trip went and I told them fine, even though my mind was still back on that mountain. We ate something small, and after a while I started to calm down. The warmth of the house, the sound of people talking. It made what happened feel far away, like I had overreacted. After dinner, we decided to leave, figuring maybe we'd drive around town for a bit before I dropped her off. I walked her outside, the night cool and still. The car sat under the streetlight, a soft orange glow catching the dew that had started to form on the metal. I opened the passenger door for her like I always did, then walked around the back to get to my side. That's when I saw it. At first I thought it was just dirt from the drive, but when I looked closer, I froze. Along the trunk, the taillight, the curve of the rear window, there were handprints. Not full, clean prints, but smeared ones. The same pale, muddy color as the water from that puddle I'd stepped in. You could see where fingers had dragged, where palms had pressed. They started low near the bottom of the trunk and moved upward in a slow, deliberate pattern. Each one higher, closer to the cabin. The last one was clear as day. Right on the back window, a full hand, long fingers splayed wide, pressed flat against the glass directly behind where we'd been sitting. My breath caught in my throat. For a second I couldn't move. It was as if every nerve in my body recognized it before my mind did. The exact same muddy color, the same watery tan I'd stepped into earlier. I stood there staring, my skin crawling, a deep cold sinking into me. She got out of the car to see what was wrong, and when she followed my gaze, she stopped dead. I could see her shoulders stiffen. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. The pattern was too clear to mistake. Someone or something had been moving closer to us while we sat in that car, touching the metal, creeping toward the driver's side. It wasn't an animal. The prints were too human, too deliberate. The streaks showed movement, hesitant at first, then bolder. Whoever it was had been watching us from behind, getting closer inch by inch, and the feeling in my back had been the only warning I got. I don't remember how long we stood there, but the night felt endless. Every sound, the distant bark of a dog, the buzz of the streetlight, felt too loud, like the world had suddenly gone hollow. When I finally managed to move, I told her to get back inside. We didn't drive anywhere that night. Later, I tried to wash the prints off, but they didn't come off easily. The mud had dried into a thin film, clinging stubbornly to the paint as if it had soaked into it. Even after scrubbing, faint outlines remained. For days afterward, every time I walked past the car, I'd catch a glimpse of those shapes in the right light. Those long, pale handprints smeared along the back glass. I never went back up that mountain again. For years after, I thought about it. How far we were from anyone, how quiet it had been, how that strange puddle had been sitting right where we parked. Can't prove what it was or who had been up there. Maybe some drifter living in the woods. Maybe someone who had followed us for reasons I'll never know. But the more I think about it, the more certain I am that the feeling in my back wasn't just fear. It was something human, awareness, instinct, telling me that someone was standing just behind the car, waiting. And I still remember the weight of it, that invisible pressure, and how it built until it felt electric. I've never felt anything like it since, and I hope I never do again. Because now, when I think back on that night, I know it wasn't my imagination. Something was there with us on that mountain, close enough to leave its hand on the glass, close enough that I could feel it through the seat, through the metal, through the air itself. And when I realized it, standing under that streetlight with those muddy prints glowing faintly in the dark, every single hair on my body stood on end, because I knew that if I hadn't started the car when I did, if I'd ignored that jolt for even a few more minutes, whoever left those prints might not have stopped at the window. I remember that night as clearly as if it happened last week, even though it's been more than a decade. It was in northeastern Georgia, somewhere near what I think was called Cooch's Bridge or Cooch Campground. The name stuck in my mind because the guy I was traveling with made a dumb joke about it, laughing like a teenager. That was just how he was. Immature, restless, always chasing some weird thrill or sensation. He used to experiment with all kinds of stuff, though at that time he was clean, or at least what he called clean. He still smoked weed, but compared to his past, that was nothing. He always told me that smoking helped him connect with nature, that it opened him up to the world in a way nothing else did. I never really understood that, but I went along with it because arguing with him usually wasn't worth it. We were on our way from South Carolina to Colorado, driving a small U-Haul that rattled constantly on the highway. It was late spring, warm but not too humid yet, and we'd been driving most of the day. We stopped in Atlanta to meet one of his friends, someone I didn't know. And after that, he said he wanted to camp somewhere in the mountains before continuing west. I didn't mind the idea of camping. It was cheaper than a motel, and we both liked being outdoors, but what came next wasn't really what I had in mind. It was sometime after 10 p.m. when we turned off the main road. The air was thick, and the sky had that deep inky color it gets in the woods when there's no light for miles. He was behind the wheel, and we were both tired but wired from the long drive. The headlights cut through the trees as we wound our way up some narrow gravel road, and after a while, I realized I didn't see any signs for a campground anymore. Just endless pines, thick undergrowth, and patches of fog near the low spots. He said we were exploring. I didn't like the sound of that. He told me he wanted to show me something. Said it was one of his favorite things to do back home in South Carolina. Drive into the woods at night, park somewhere deep, turn off all the lights, and just stand there in the dark. He said you could feel the eyes on you, and that it made him feel alive. The way he said it sent a chill through me. I remember gripping the door handle and staring out the window at the dense blackness. The trees like shadows stacked on top of each other. I told him it sounded weird, that I didn't like the idea of stopping out there, but he laughed it off. It's nature, he said. You love nature, don't you? I did, but not like that. Not in the middle of nowhere at 11 at night with no cell service, and a guy who seemed a little too eager to wander into the dark. We kept driving. Deeper and deeper, the road narrowing until branches started scraping the sides of the U-Haul. Started feeling uneasy, the kind of unease that builds slowly, like a warning your body feels before your brain can make sense of it. I wanted to say something again, but I didn't want to sound scared. He had a machete lying between the seats. He said it was for clearing brush or cutting firewood, and he kept tapping the handle absently with his fingers as we drove. After another 10 minutes, he stopped the truck and shut off the engine. The headlights clicked off, and suddenly it was absolute blackness, the kind of dark that swallows you whole. No streetlights, no moonlight breaking through the trees, nothing but the faint ticking of the cooling engine. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own pulse in my ears. He got out first, his door creaking loudly in the quiet. The sound of his boots crunching leaves faded as he walked a few steps away. I didn't want to get out. Every instinct told me to stay put, but he called back for me to follow. I remember my hand shaking slightly as I opened the door and stepped into the cool night air. It smelled like pine sap and damp soil, that heavy earthy smell that comes from deep woods after sunset. We walked a short distance into what felt like a small clearing. I could tell because the ground was flatter, and I couldn't feel branches brushing against my shoulders anymore. But I couldn't see a single thing. Not my hands, not the outline of him, nothing. It was total blindness. He told me to stand still, though he was a few yards away, and I could only locate him by the sound of his breathing and the faint rustle of his clothes. So I stood there. My body was rigid, my heart hammering hard in my chest. I tried to listen, to focus on the forest sounds, but there weren't many. Just a few distant chirps from insects, and the occasional creak of a tree shifting in the wind. It was so still that the silence itself started to feel heavy, like it had a weight pressing down on me. After maybe 30 seconds, I wanted to go back. My nerves were fraying. The air felt thick and charged, like before a storm. Though the sky was clear when we drove in, I remember whispering that I was done, that I wanted to head back to the truck. That's when it happened. I felt something brush against my right leg. It was fast, low to the ground, and it moved exactly the way a cat does when it rubs against you. It was soft, smooth, and deliberate, like it meant to make contact. For a split second, my brain filled in the image of a cat weaving around my legs, pressing against my calves before darting away. Only there was nothing there. The feeling was so clear, so unmistakable, that my whole body froze. My stomach dropped. It wasn't like a twig brushing past or a leaf falling. It was something alive. My breath caught in my throat, and before I even thought about it, I gasped and stumbled backward, my arms flailing in the dark. I must have made a noise because I heard him move too. Heard his boots scuff the dirt as he turned. I didn't wait. I bolted back toward where I thought the truck was, running blind through the blackness. My hands were outstretched, and I slammed into a tree before finding the open space of the road again. When I finally reached the truck, my heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I wrenched the door open and climbed in, slamming it shut behind me. He appeared a moment later, out of breath, his machete in one hand. He looked confused, maybe even a little spooked himself, though he tried to play it off. I didn't care. I just kept saying something rubbed me. I said it again and again. Like if I repeated it enough times it would make sense. Felt exactly like a cat. Not rough fur like a raccoon or bristles like a wild animal. It was soft, familiar, and it had pressed close enough that I could feel its warmth for a moment before it darted away. We sat there for a while, the engine still off, trying to make sense of what had happened. I stared out the windshield, but the darkness was absolute. I didn't see movement, no glowing eyes, no sound of footsteps retreating. Just that same heavy stillness. Eventually, he started the truck, and the headlights flicked on, washing the trees in pale light. Nothing was there, just tall pines, uneven ground, and patches of underbrush that looked undisturbed. He joked weakly about how I must have imagined it. Or maybe a stray cat had followed someone to the area. But I could tell he didn't fully believe what he was saying. The whole drive out, he kept glancing at the mirror, checking behind us even though we didn't see anything. The further we drove, the less real it felt. I started questioning myself, wondering if I'd imagined it, if it had been the weed, or if maybe I'd brushed up against my own pant leg somehow. But deep down, I knew what I felt. It was alive. It had purpose. It wasn't random. When we finally found the actual campground an hour later, I didn't want to get out of the truck. We parked near a few other campers, their tents dimly lit by lanterns, and the sense of safety came back a little. We slept in the truck that night instead of pitching a tent. I couldn't shake that feeling of something moving beside me in the dark. The next morning, everything looked so normal it was almost insulting. The trees were bright green, the ground damp with dew, birds chirping everywhere. I stepped out and looked around, half expecting to see paw prints or signs of an animal. But there was nothing. The ground was soft, but there weren't even indentations. The whole forest looked undisturbed, as if the night before had never happened. He kept talking about hill people, the ones he claimed lived deep in the woods, off-grid, rarely seen. He said maybe that's what I felt, someone's dog or something. But I knew the difference. It wasn't the touch of a dog. It wasn't aggressive or rough. It was deliberate, slow, and almost affectionate. That's what disturbed me most, the familiarity of it. Later, when I thought back on it, the moment that stood out wasn't the touch itself, but the silence before it. It was too quiet. The woods always have some kind of sound, crickets, wind, frogs, something. But that night, right before I felt it, there was nothing. Absolute stillness, like the forest itself had paused for a second. I've camped plenty of times since then, in different states and different kinds of terrain, and I've never experienced anything like that again. But that night changed how I felt about being alone in the woods. Before, I always thought of nature as peaceful, predictable in its own way. That night made me realize that there are moments out there where you're not in control, where something else might be watching, moving, waiting, and you won't even know what it is until it's too late to react. It wasn't supernatural. I don't believe in that. Whatever brushed against me was real, physical, and alive. Maybe it was a feral cat, though what it was doing miles from anywhere I couldn't explain. Maybe it was something smaller, like a raccoon, though I've never felt one move like that. Or maybe it was something entirely different, an animal that saw us standing there frozen in the dark and decided to investigate. Still, I can't shake that final detail. How gentle it was. It didn't scratch, bite, or push. It just brushed past as if acknowledging me for a brief second before vanishing. After that trip, I stopped talking to him. Not because of that night specifically, but because it felt like a turning point. I realized that some people go looking for things in the dark, and others just happen to find them. I didn't want to be the kind that went looking anymore. Every once in a while, though, when I'm camping or hiking and the forest goes suddenly quiet, I think about that night in northeast Georgia. I think about the stillness, the dark so thick it erased everything, and that faint fleeting touch on my leg, like something small and unseen reminding me that I was never really alone out there. It happened more than 40 years ago, but even now I can remember every second of it with a kind of clarity that still makes my chest tighten. I wasn't young enough to chalk it up to imagination, and I wasn't old enough to think I'd seen everything yet. It was one of those nights that starts out harmless and ends up burned into the back of your mind forever. I had gone to visit a friend who lived deep in the Appalachian Hills near Hot Springs, Virginia. Back then, the roads out there were little more than narrow strips of pavement twisting between shadowy walls of trees, with just enough room for 2 cars to pass if one of them moved onto the shoulder. Her family lived far from town, tucked back off a long dirt drive, lined with black walnut trees and overgrown brush that rattled against the sides of your car when you drove too close. I'd spent the whole day at her place helping. Her dad with some chores, eating dinner, and then heading into town with her and a few friends for the evening. It was one of those warm nights where the air never really cools down, and the crickets seem louder than anything else. We stayed later than we planned, talking and laughing until the clock crept past midnight. By the time we got back in my car, the roads were completely empty, and the only light came from the moon and the dim yellow beams of my headlights. We took the familiar route home, winding through those narrow mountain roads where every curve felt like it might drop off into darkness if you misjudged your steering. The trees leaned in close, their branches forming an archway that blocked out most of the sky. I remember how the tires hummed softly against the pavement, how the headlights cut narrow tunnels of visibility through the dark. The further we drove, the quieter it got. It was the kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you start to notice every small sound. The tick of the cooling engine, the gravel crunching under the tires, the faint buzz of bugs outside. The radio barely came in on those roads, so we drove in silence most of the way, just the occasional hum of a low AM station fading in and out. After a few miles, we came to a fork in the road I didn't recognize. The left path looked wider, smoother, probably the right way back, but I wasn't completely sure. I slowed down, rolling to a near stop as the car idled and the headlights swept across the trees ahead. That's when we both saw it. At first, it just looked like a shape, something hunched low behind a clump of brush on the side of the road, maybe 10 or 15 feet ahead. It was dark enough that it blended into the shadows at first, but as the headlights hit it square on, it seemed to shift slightly, like it realized it had been seen. My first thought was that it was a bear. The area had plenty of them, and it wasn't unusual for one to wander near a road at night. But then it stood up. The movement was slow, almost deliberate, like whatever it was didn't care how long it took. When it rose to full height, it was taller than any person I'd ever seen, easily over 7 feet, maybe more. Its body looked completely black, not like fur, but like something draped in heavy cloth that didn't reflect any light. I remember thinking it looked like a curtain or a robe, thick and shapeless. But what froze me wasn't the size. It was the face where a face should have been. There was something pale and flat that caught the headlights. It wasn't a human face. It looked like bone, bleached, sun-worn, like the skull of a large animal. The nearest thing my mind could compare it to was a cow skull, except it seemed bigger, more angular, like it didn't quite fit right on the shoulders beneath it. The eye sockets looked hollow, empty, and the light from the car didn't seem to reach inside them. For a second it just stood there, and the car idled quietly, both of us frozen, staring through the windshield. I don't remember breathing. I don't even remember blinking. It didn't move closer. It didn't run or turn away. It just stood tall and still facing the car, with that pale skull-like face pointed right at us. The air inside the car felt thick, like it was harder to breathe. I remember gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my fingers hurt. Somewhere deep in my chest, I could feel something vibrating, like a sound more than a feeling. But I couldn't hear anything clearly. I think my mind was trying to protect me from it, to block it out. Later, when I thought back, I realized there was a sound. It was a low, deep growl, not like a dog or a bear, but something so low that you felt it before you heard it. It came from the thing standing in the headlights, steady and rumbling, like the sound of something enormous exhaling slowly through its chest. The moment felt endless. I don't know how long we sat there, maybe half a minute, maybe 5. Time didn't feel real in that moment. The only movement came from the faint flicker of moths crossing through the headlights and the slow shifting of the shadows in the trees. When it finally moved, it didn't run. It just turned its head slightly, as if it had lost interest. Then it crouched again, lowering itself back behind the bush until it disappeared completely. I don't remember driving off. I just remember the next stretch of road. The car moving faster than it should have on those turns. My hands locked on the wheel, and the sound of gravel scattering behind the tires. My friend didn't say a word, and neither did I. We just drove. When we finally reached her family's long driveway, the porch light of their house looked like the brightest thing in the world. I pulled in, shut off the car, and just sat there. The forest was still all around us, dark and heavy, but I could still feel that same vibration in my chest, that faint echo of whatever noise it made. That night, I barely slept. Every sound outside made me flinch. The wind, the creak of branches, the calls of night animals. I kept replaying what we'd seen over and over, trying to make sense of it. The shape, the skull, the sound. None of it fit together with anything normal. The next morning, we went into the kitchen where her parents were sitting. I remember the smell of coffee, bacon frying, sunlight streaming through the curtains. It all felt so normal that I almost convinced myself to drop it. But I couldn't. I told them what we saw, what I thought we saw. I expected them to laugh, to tell me it was a trick of the headlights, a shadow, or some local prankster trying to scare us. But they didn't laugh. Her father's face went pale almost instantly. He didn't say much at first, just sat there staring, like he was trying to piece something together. Her mother looked away, shaking her head. He said he'd heard of people seeing something like that before. He didn't call it anything specific, just said that around their part of the mountains, folks had mentioned seeing a tall, dark shape, sometimes with a pale face or no face at all. He said a few of those people had woken up the next day to find their livestock mutilated or missing, sheep mostly. He mentioned one man who had nearly hit something that ran across the road late one night. He described it as tall and draped in black, with something white near the top that flashed in the headlights before disappearing into the woods. That was when he asked if we'd heard anything. At first, neither of us could remember, but as soon as he asked, it came flooding back. The low, vibrating growl that had filled the air like it came from the ground itself. We hadn't registered it at the time. Our brains had filed it away as a background noise, something too strange to process. But once he mentioned it, the memory hit hard, and I could almost feel it again deep in my chest. For the rest of that day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still out there, watching. Every time I looked toward the woods behind their house, I half expected to see that pale shape moving between the trees. Before I left that weekend, her dad told me to take the main road out, even if it took longer. He said not to use that fork again, not to go near that stretch of woods after dark. He didn't explain why. I followed his advice. I've never gone back to that road. Years later, I tried to find something, an explanation, a local story, anything that could make sense of it. Some people mentioned folklore about death omens or mountain spirits, but I never believed in that. I thought maybe it was someone in a costume, but the sheer size of it didn't fit that idea. And that sound, it wasn't something a person could make. The thing that unsettles me most is that it didn't act like an animal or a person. It didn't run away when the headlights hit it. It didn't attack, just watched It moved like it didn't care if we saw it or not, like it had seen cars 100 times before, and didn't think we were worth the effort. Decades later, I still think about that night sometimes, especially when I drive through rural mountain roads after dark. I'll see the way the light catches on the trees or glints off a fence post, and for a split second, I'll think I see that pale shape again. It's been over 40 years, but the memory hasn't dulled. Whenever I think of it, I can still picture the exact spot in the road, the angle of the headlights, the look of that face, or whatever it was, gleaming in the dark, and I still remember that sound, deep and heavy, like it came from something far too big to exist that close without shaking the ground beneath us. Whatever it was real. I don't have an explanation, but I know what I saw, and after all these years, it still chills me in a way nothing else ever has. I still remember that night as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I was around 10 years old, and every summer my parents would take us to Meekum Lake campgrounds. We stayed there for weeks at a time almost the whole summer. My parents loved it because it was quiet, surrounded by thick forest and mountains on all sides. There were only a few other campers scattered around the area, and once the sun went down, the place felt like it was swallowed by the wilderness. You could hear nothing but the occasional crackle of firewood, the hum of insects, and the faint lapping of water from the lake. That first night of the trip, we had set up our big tent, a tan-colored canvas one that could fit all of us comfortably. It had 2 large zippered doors and a couple of screened windows that could be unzipped from the inside. My uncle had come with us that year, and we were all packed in together, sleeping bags spread out over a tarp. I remember the air smelled like pine and campfire smoke, and the ground under my sleeping bag was uneven with roots pressing up into my back. My parents had been drinking with some of their friends at a nearby campsite that evening, laughing loudly by the fire, music playing faintly from a small speaker. When they finally came back to our tent, they were stumbling and slurring their words. Within minutes, they passed out completely. My uncle wasn't much better off. He was snoring before I even turned off my flashlight. I lay there on my back, staring at the faint glow of the tent walls from the fire outside, listening to the crickets and the occasional pop from dying embers. Everything felt still. I wasn't tired yet, just lying there, listening. Then out of nowhere, something changed. The air inside the tent suddenly felt heavier, colder. It was like the temperature dropped 20 degrees in a matter of seconds. My skin prickled, and my breath felt shaky. I couldn't explain it, but a horrible sense of dread washed over me, like something terrible was about to happen. I remember holding my breath and listening harder. At first I thought maybe I was just spooking myself, but then I heard it. The sound of sticks snapping very softly at first, somewhere just beyond our campsite. It wasn't random either, it was slow, deliberate. A single step, then another, then a pause. The ground in that area was covered with dry twigs and pine needles, and whatever was out there was heavy enough to crush them underfoot. I froze completely. The steps came closer. They weren't the light, erratic movements of a raccoon or a deer. They were paced even, like someone walking upright. I could hear faint breathing between the steps, raspy, unsteady, but deep. The sound grew clearer until I was sure it was only a few feet from the tent. I remember thinking it was probably just someone wandering around, maybe a drunk camper who got lost. But something in me knew that wasn't it. There was an intent to the sound, a slow circling pattern. Then I heard it brush against the tent. The thin canvas pressed inward, right above my head, like someone had dragged their hand slowly across it. I could hear the faint scrape of skin on fabric. Every muscle in my body locked up. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I wanted to call out for my parents, but my voice wouldn't come out. I was afraid that if I made a sound, it would stop and focus directly on me. It started walking around the tent. The footsteps moved steadily, crunching twigs and leaves, always staying close enough that I could hear the slight rustle of its movement brushing the canvas as it passed. It wasn't moving fast. It was slow, almost like it was inspecting the tent, pressing its body against it in certain places. I could feel it through the fabric, faint pressure shifting around as it made a full circle. It kept doing that, circling and brushing up against the tent. Sometimes it would stop completely, and the silence that followed was worse than the noise. I'd wait, barely breathing, then it would start again. I had no idea how much time was passing. It felt like hours. My parents' snoring didn't stop once, which somehow made it worse. I was completely alone with it, wide awake and shaking so badly that my sleeping bag made faint rustling sounds. At one point, it pressed so close against the tent wall that I could see the faint shape of its outline through the fabric when the dying firelight flickered outside. The figure was tall, too tall to be one of the other campers, and the shoulders looked narrow, the limbs long and thin. I remember thinking it didn't look right for a person. Its movements were jerky, like it wasn't balanced properly, but it was still walking upright. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination. Maybe it was an animal rubbing against the tent. But then I heard it exhale. It was low and rough, like a panting sound. It didn't sound like any animal I'd ever heard. It sounded closer to human breathing, but too deep, too strained. I don't know how long it had been before I remembered my uncle's tent window was unzipped. It was just a small screen opening near his sleeping area, and through it, you could see the outside if you looked from the right angle. My uncle was passed out beside it, his arm over his face, breathing heavily. The window faced the edge of the woods where the noises were coming from. My curiosity was fighting against my fear. Every instinct told me to stay still, to keep my eyes shut. But I needed to see it. I needed to know what it was. Slowly, as quietly as I could, I turned onto my side and shifted a little closer to that window. The nylon of my sleeping bag made a soft sound and I froze, terrified it would hear me. But the thing kept moving, still circling. I waited until I heard it come around again, the footsteps crunching closer, slower now. Then it passed by the window. I'll never forget what I saw. It wasn't a person. Its skin was pale, almost grayish-white under the faint moonlight. It looked stretched over its bones like it hadn't eaten in months. Its arms were too long, hanging down almost to its knees, and its head was completely bald. When it turned slightly, I saw its face, or what was left of it. The eyes were black, not like pupils, but solid black. There was no expression, no sound, just those black eyes scanning the tent as it moved past. I jerked back instinctively, heart hammering in my chest so hard I thought it would wake my parents. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to convince myself I hadn't seen it, that maybe it was just the moonlight and my imagination. But then it brushed against the tent again, hard this time, right near where I was lying. The fabric pressed down inches from my face, and I could hear it breathing on the other side. It was right there. I didn't move again after that. I couldn't. My whole body was frozen stiff and every second stretched out endlessly. The creature kept circling the tent, sometimes faster, sometimes slower. Once it stopped right behind my uncle, and stayed there for what felt like 10 minutes. I could hear its faint breathing, the occasional creak of movement. Then it would walk off again. The night dragged on forever. I don't think I even blinked for hours. The sky outside slowly began to lighten, first gray, then faint orange. I didn't realize until that moment how much the silence had changed. The thing wasn't moving anymore. The woods had gone still, but this time it was a peaceful stillness. When I finally opened my eyes and looked out through that window again, there was nothing there, just the morning mist over the lake and the first birds beginning to chirp. I didn't move until sunlight started streaming into the tent. Only then did I let out a shaky breath and sit up. My parents were still asleep, my uncle snoring loudly. When they all woke up, I tried to tell them what happened. My hands were shaking so bad that I could barely unzip the tent door. I explained everything, the noises, the breathing, the pale figure outside. They looked at me the same way adults do when a kid tells a scary story. My dad laughed, said I must have had a nightmare. My mom told me I probably just saw shadows or a deer walking by. My uncle didn't even look up from his coffee. I wanted to argue, to tell them I was awake all night, that I hadn't imagined it. But I was exhausted. My body felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. I remember sitting down on the picnic table bench and resting my head on my arms, the morning sunlight warm on my face. The next thing I knew, it was afternoon and I'd slept straight through lunch. When I woke up, everything was normal again. Kids were swimming in the lake, parents were grilling food, and laughter filled the air. It was almost enough to make me doubt myself. But that night, when I looked around the campsite, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were faint prints in the dirt behind our tent, too long and narrow to be a person's, but not shaped like any animal I knew either. The ground had hardened a bit from the morning sun, but I could still make out where something had walked in circles around our tent, again and again. No one else noticed them. My parents brushed it off as raccoon tracks, but I knew what I'd seen. I knew what I'd heard. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't an animal and it wasn't a dream. It had come close enough for me to hear it breathe. It had walked around our tent for hours like it was studying us. After that night, I never slept easy at Meacham Lake again. Every time the wind rustled the trees or a twig snapped in the dark, I'd jolt awake, heart racing, waiting to hear that slow, deliberate sound of footsteps coming closer. But it never came back. Still, even now as an adult, sometimes when I camp or even sleep with a window open, I'll wake up in the middle of the night with that same cold feeling creeping over me, like something's just outside, watching. And when I listen closely, sometimes I think I can still hear the faint crunch of twigs circling around me. Slow, steady, patient. I live in the northeastern part of Alabama, right up against the foothills where the land starts folding into the lower ridges of the Appalachians. The woods here are thick, dense oak and hickory, with patches of pine and undergrowth that can swallow you whole if you step 10 feet off a trail. The land has a certain heaviness to it, like it's been holding on to something for a long time. The locals don't talk about the strange things they hear, not because they don't believe them, but because they believe them too much. 46, a retired Green Beret, 17 years in the Army, 14 of those years as an 18B, Special Forces weapons sergeant. I've seen things overseas, human things, that should make anything here feel small. I've been shot at, blown up, hunted. Fear is not something I'm unfamiliar with, but there are moments out here, in these woods, that make every ounce of that training feel worthless. Moments where your skin just crawls for no reason, your stomach turns heavy, and your instincts start whispering leave. When I say I'm armed, I don't mean I've got a revolver or a pocket knife. I mean I'm armed. My sidearm is a Glock 20 that I handload myself, 200 grain hard cast, pushing near max pressure. I carry that everywhere. If I'm walking the back of the property or checking trail cameras, I've got my short-barreled AR slung over my shoulder. It's a high-end build, thousands sunk into it, with a thermal scope and backup night vision. I'm not a paranoid man. I'm a prepared one. My wife and I run a small wolf sanctuary on our property. We've got 8 wolves, all rescues, spread across several fenced acres. I'm also a trained wildlife biologist now, courtesy of the GI Bill. I know what moves through these woods. I know how deer sound when they're spooked, how coyotes call to each other across valleys, how a bear moves when it's hungry. There isn't much that can catch me off guard when it comes to nature, but there are things out here that don't act like nature. It started one cold night in early winter, right around midnight. The temperature had dropped fast, maybe 20 degrees in just a few hours. I was sitting on the porch, checking a few of my trail cams on the laptop. The wolves were quiet, which was unusual. Normally they're restless at night, howling back and forth, pacing, reacting to coyotes or deer. But that night, silence. The kind of silence that makes you notice every small sound. Your own breathing, the creak of wood, the wind moving through dry leaves. Then one of the wolves started whining, not barking, not howling, just this low, uneasy whine that crawled under your skin. Within seconds, the others joined in, all pacing along the back fence line. They weren't looking at each other. They were all looking outward, into the tree line behind the sanctuary. I grabbed my AR and my NVGs and headed down the path that runs behind the pens. The ground was frozen solid, so my footsteps crunched as I walked. I moved quietly, but I didn't bother with stealth. Out there, when the animals act like that, it's better to make noise. Let whatever it is know you're not prey. I stopped near the last pen, maybe 50 yards from the back of the property. Through the goggles, the world glowed in pale green. I scanned the woods, nothing, no heat signatures. Not even a raccoon. That was strange. The forest is never empty at night. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I felt it. The air shifted. It's hard to explain if you haven't felt it before. Like the atmosphere thickened, pressing in on you. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. The wolves went from whining to full-blown panic, slamming against the fences, tails tucked. I scanned again with the thermal. Still nothing. But I could hear something. Slow movement. Not the quick scurry of a small animal. Not the heavy rhythm of a deer. It was deliberate, measured. It sounded like someone walking barefoot over leaves. I raised my rifle and aimed toward the sound. Nothing appeared on the scope. But I could feel it out there, just beyond where the goggles could reach. The feeling you get when something intelligent is watching you. The hair on my neck stood up, and every instinct from years in the field told me to fall back. I started backing up toward the pens, keeping my rifle aimed downrange. The wolves were all huddled together now, pressed against the fence farthest from the woods. One of them, Ronan, our biggest male, let out a growl I'd never heard from him before. It wasn't aggression. It was fear. Pure animal fear. I stopped near the gate, flipped the goggles up, and switched to the thermal. That's when I saw it, just for a second. A blotch of heat, tall, upright, and then gone. The temperature dropped so fast that my breath came out like smoke. I didn't run. I've never run from anything in my life. But I didn't stay out there either. I backed up the whole way, rifle ready, until I was back on the porch. The next morning I went out to check for tracks. Nothing. Not a single mark in the frozen soil, not even where I knew I'd seen that heat signature. The wolves refused to leave their dens all day. That was the first time. The second time came about 2 weeks later. This time I was deep in the woods, checking on one of my research stations about 3 miles from the house. It's an area I know like the back of my hand. Hilly terrain, thick oak forest, a few shallow creeks. I'd gone out early to swap SD cards and replace batteries. The day was overcast, sky a dull gray. Everything was quiet, almost too quiet. The kind of quiet that gets under your skin. No bird calls. No squirrels moving in the trees. I'd just finished changing a battery when I noticed it again. The air shifting, like static. It made the hairs on my arms stand up. I froze listening. Then I heard it, that same slow, heavy movement. It was farther out this time, maybe 100 yards, but it was circling. I raised my rifle and scanned through the scope. Nothing. I switched to thermal. Still nothing. The scope showed the usual faint heat from the trees and ground, but whatever was moving out there wasn't giving off anything. That's impossible. Everything warm-blooded shows something. Then came the smell. Rot. Wet earth mixed with something metallic, like blood left too long in the sun. It wasn't faint. It was strong enough to make me gag. I turned slowly, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from, but it surrounded me. Every part of my body screamed to get out of there. Started moving fast, but not running. Trying to keep my breathing even. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, like eyes pressed against my skin. When I finally broke through the last stretch of woods and reached the old logging road, it vanished. The air went still. The smell was gone. I didn't go back for a week. When I finally did, I found the camera 30 yards from where I'd left it. Ripped off the tree, the metal bracket bent like it had been twisted by hand. The SD card was gone. That's when I started believing there are things here that don't fit into categories. Not cryptids, not myths, just something wrong. After that, I started sleeping less. The wolves were restless almost every night. Sometimes around 3 in the morning, they'd all start howling at once, facing the same direction, the ridge behind the property. Tried walking out there once at that hour. I made it halfway down the trail before I felt that same weight in the air, that same pressure, and turned back. I'm not ashamed of that. One night the power went out. The house went completely dark. I keep backup generators, but before I even reached for the flashlight, I knew something was wrong. The wolves were silent again, dead silent. Then the sound came. From the ridge, a low hum like a vibration running through the ground. It built slowly, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Then it stopped, just stopped. I went out onto the porch with my rifle and NVGs. The woods were pitch black. Even with night vision, it was hard to see. Too much static interference, like the signal was being jammed. Then, deep in the tree line, I saw something move. Not fast, not aggressive, just shifting. It wasn't shaped like a person. It wasn't shaped like an animal either. It was tall, but the outline didn't make sense. It flickered like heat distortion. There 1 second and gone the next. The air was freezing, but I was sweating. I raised my rifle, but I didn't shoot. After about 10 seconds, it was gone. The power came back on. The wolves started howling again. All at once, like whatever had been there was finally gone. I didn't sleep for 2 days after that. I've lived here long enough to know the land itself feels alive sometimes. It's not just the wildlife, it's something deeper, older. I don't think it's supernatural. I think it's something this land holds on to. Something trapped between what's real and what isn't. I don't tell people about this. Not because I'm afraid they'll think I'm crazy, but because I believe that talking about it might draw it closer. All I know is this. I've been scared before, but never like that. Not when I was in combat. Not when I was cornered by men with rifles. This was different. This was wrong. Now every time I step outside at night, I scan the ridge. The wolves still watch it too. They don't make a sound when they see it. They just go still, ears flat, eyes fixed on that same patch of darkness. And every now and then on the coldest nights, when the air gets heavy and the wind stops moving, I feel that pressure again. I don't stay outside long when that happens. I just go back inside, lock the doors, and wait for morning. Because whatever's out there in those woods, it's not supposed to be here. And I don't think it ever wanted to be. I remember that winter day in West Virginia like it was etched into the back of my mind. My uncle's farm had always felt like the safest place in the world to me. It was tucked deep into the rolling hills of southeast West Virginia, surrounded by woods that seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. My uncle had lived there since the 70s, long before I was even born. And over the years, he'd built a handful of small houses scattered across the property for family to stay in whenever they visited. Some of my aunts and uncles lived there full time. Others came and went, but no matter the season, there was always someone around, always laughter somewhere on that land. My mom, my older sister, and I spent weeks there every year. It was like a second home, full of cousins and animals and that quiet, peaceful air you can only find in the countryside. When I was little, I never once felt afraid there. The farm felt alive in a comforting way. The creak of the old barn doors, the rustle of the wind through the bare trees, the low hum of tractors in the distance. Even the woods that framed the property, though thick and dark, felt familiar to me. I used to think nothing bad could ever happen there. I had an imaginary friend I only played with at the farm when I was very young. I never thought it was strange back then. Just something about the place made me feel like there were always things unseen around me. Friendly, harmless things that liked to play. As I got older, that imaginary friend faded away, and I stopped thinking about it. By the time I was about 8, I had moved past those early childhood fantasies and started to crave independence. That was the year I started exploring on my own. The farm stretched for miles. Behind the main house, the land rolled upward toward what I used to call a mountain, though in truth, it was probably just a massive hill. The climb was steep enough to make my legs burn, and at the top you could see the rooftops of the houses below, and the ribbons of smoke rising from the chimneys. I loved that view. The woods at the top were dense. Oak, hickory, maple, with the occasional pine scattered in between. My uncles hunted deer up there in the fall and winter, and they had built small tree stands high up in the branches, sturdy little platforms with wooden ladders leading up to them. They always told me not to go too far into the woods alone. But that winter I thought I was old enough to handle myself. It had snowed the night before, one of those heavy Appalachian snows that coated everything in white and made the air feel thick and quiet. The world was still that morning, muffled by the blanket of snow. I remember the sound of my boots crunching, how it echoed around me like the woods were holding their breath. I had decided to find one of the tree stands that day, the one I liked best, near a narrow creek that ran down the slope. I'd been there before with my uncle and thought I remembered the way, but the deeper I went, the less sure I became. Every tree started to look the same. I passed a few landmarks I recognized, a rotted log, a cluster of rocks shaped like steps. But then I crossed the creek, and the woods seemed to change. The snow was untouched there, and my own footprints were the only marks I could see. I remember thinking how quiet it was. No birds, no wind, just my breathing and the soft hiss of the creek. I tried to follow the slope of the land, figuring it would lead me to the right spot. But after another few minutes, I realized I was turned around. I stopped by the creek to rest. I wasn't scared, not yet. I remember sitting down on a rock, brushing snow off with my mitten, and staring at the water sliding under a crust of ice. I could see my breath curling in front of me. My cheeks were red and stung from the cold. I sat there for maybe 3 minutes, no more, trying to figure out where I'd gone wrong. Then the sound came. It wasn't a sound I had ever heard before. It started out sharp, almost like a scream echoing through the trees. It wasn't an animal call I recognized, though I'd heard plenty on that farm. Foxes, owls, even the occasional coyote. This was different. It was high and raw, like someone being hurt. I froze, heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. At first I told myself it had to be a fox. My uncles had said they sometimes made screams that could sound like a person. But then, before I could convince myself of that, I heard another sound, crying. Soft at first, then louder, as if whoever it was had come closer. It was a woman's voice, or at least it sounded like one. The crying wasn't just noise. It had emotion in it, deep, wrenching sadness that made my stomach twist. I remember sitting there not breathing, just listening. The sound echoed through the trees, bouncing off the hills. Impossible to tell where it came from. I looked around, half expecting to see one of my cousins peeking from behind a tree. They loved to mess with me. I shouted once, calling out that it wasn't funny. My voice sounded small and strange against the silence. Nothing answered me. The crying just went on, steady and distant, always at the same volume no matter how I turned my head. That's when I started to move. I followed my own tracks back toward where I thought the farm was. The snow was deeper than I remembered, and every step seemed to sink farther. The crying didn't fade. If anything, it followed me, floating through the woods like a current in the air. Sometimes it sounded farther away, then close again, almost right behind me. The woods felt different now. The light had shifted and the shadows had grown longer. I could feel the cold biting through my mittens. I tried to focus on my footprints, following them carefully. But in a few places, the snow had filled them in, and I lost the trail for a moment. Panic started to set in. I remember how heavy my breathing got, how my chest hurt from the cold air. I tripped more than once, my hands breaking through the crusted snow, scraping against the frozen ground underneath. My mittens got wet, and by the time I finally saw the open field below, my fingers were burning. The crying and screaming still hadn't stopped. And I remember thinking that no prank would last that long. No one could fake that kind of sound for that long. When I finally broke through the tree line and saw my uncle's house down the hill, I ran as fast as I could. The snow made it awkward, but adrenaline carried me. My boots slipped and I stumbled, but I didn't stop until I was at the kitchen door. I burst through it, slammed it behind me, and leaned against it, gasping for breath. The warmth of the house hit me, but it didn't feel comforting. My legs were shaking, and my mittens were streaked with blood where the fabric had torn. I remember the smell of food cooking, the sound of voices, and the realization that everyone was there. My mom, my sister, my cousins, my uncles, all of them. Every face turned toward me, surprised. My uncle had snow on his boots and was pulling on his coat. They told me later they had just been getting ready to come look for me. Apparently, I had been gone for hours. I had only meant to walk from my aunt's house to my uncle's, but I had taken that detour into the woods without telling anyone. My mom said I looked pale, my face white as the snow outside, and my hands were shaking. She asked me what had happened, but I couldn't find the words. All I could think about was that sound, how it had followed me all the way back to the edge of the woods. Later, my uncle mentioned something they called the witch. Not an actual person, just a name they gave to something strange that people sometimes heard in those woods. A scream, a voice, sometimes laughter. He said everyone in the family who had lived there long enough had heard it once. They never agreed on what it was. Some said a mountain lion. Others said it was just the way the wind echoed through the hollows. But the rule had always been the same. Don't go into the woods alone. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the spare room upstairs, staring out the window at the dark line of trees along the ridge. The sky was clouded over, and the snow reflected what little light there was, so I could see the outline of the woods clearly. I thought I saw something moving between the trees once, just a shift of shadow, but I told myself it was nothing. I was a kid, scared and tired, and my mind was playing tricks on me. The next morning, my uncle and one of my cousins went up to where I said I'd been. They came back quiet. My uncle said he found my tracks and saw where I'd been sitting by the creek. He also said he found drag marks in the snow nearby, like something heavy had been pulled across it. He told me it was probably an animal. I didn't ask any more questions. Years passed and I still visited the farm. It never lost that feeling of home for me. But after that day, I couldn't bring myself to go near the woods again. I'd watch from a distance, see the wind moving through the trees, and feel that same old unease creeping back. It wasn't that I believed in anything supernatural, I never did. But there are things in the wild that don't need to be ghosts to scare you. When I was 21, we gathered at the farm again for my aunt's funeral. It was winter again, and the snow fell thick just like that year. I stood on the porch one night after everyone else had gone to bed, looking out toward the woods. The night was perfectly still. Then I thought I saw something at the tree line. 2 faint points of light, red, like eyes catching a reflection. They blinked once and vanished. I didn't stay out there long. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat down by the fire until I could hear my own breathing slow. I didn't mention it to anyone. It didn't matter whether it was an animal, a trick of the light, or something else entirely. I knew one thing for certain. Whatever was in those woods, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. Even now, years later, whenever I visit that farm, I keep my distance from the trees. The woods are still beautiful from afar, peaceful even. But I know better than to mistake silence for safety. The land holds its secrets close, and some sounds, the kind that don't fade no matter how far you run, stay with you long after the snow melts.